Welcome to the ROI Masterclass, the podcast where vision meets strategy and bold moves create measurable results. I'm Segal, interior designer and ROI strategist with 17 years of experience. I help businesses transform properties and ideas into high-performing assets. This show is specifically for real estate investors, hospitality operators, and boutique developers who aren't afraid to take risks, challenge the status quo, and demand a return on every decision they make. Each and every week, we talk with innovators and leaders across industries about the strategies and the insights and really all the unconventional thinking that turns potential into profit every single time. If you believe that smart design, decisive leadership, and strategic risk are the keys to real ROI, you're in the exact right place. Let's dive in. Today on the ROI Masterclass, we're joined by Joseph Segal, a New York City real estate strategist whose career started at just 20 years old. Joseph has worked across new development, rentals, and condo projects, partnering with some of the city's top developers and earning a reputation as an expert in New York City market intelligence. At Real New York, he leads pre-development planning and leasing for new projects, blending data, design goals, and market trends to position developments for long-term value. He's deeply connected to the fabric of New York City, both professionally and in his community work, and brings a sharp, on-the-ground perspective to one of the toughest markets in the world. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Leah, for having me. Pleasure to be here.
I'm so excited to hear more about your background, how you got to where you are today, and the trends that you're seeing, because New York City is changing a lot these days.
Yes, it absolutely is. Yeah, sure. I'll jump right in. I started in real estate. I don't know anything else. I was 20 years old in college at the time and kind of just jumped right in, got an opportunity. And I think that's kind of what's made my perspective unique in the sense I never had any formal training. I kind of jumped right into various roles across many different spectrums, particularly in the New York City market. So I jumped right in at 20 and I've been working in the real estate field ever since.
What about real estate makes you stick? Like, you could pivot at any time, but obviously there's something that keeps you going in real estate. What is that?
Yeah, I always try thinking back exactly what it was that kind of got me interested, because I remember even when I was a young kid, I always had an interest in real estate. I always found it really fascinating. I grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And as I got into my teenage years, I started to see change with different developments coming to market, and it kind of just fascinated me. But it's really the evolution of real estate. I love taking neighborhood walks around anywhere in New York City, and you see how quickly things change, how quickly development moves. So I've always been fascinated by it. I love being a part of it in whatever capacity I'm able to be a part of it. So it's really stuck with me, and I don't plan on going anywhere. It's going to be, I think, a lifetime of real estate.
I remember when I was just an intern 18 years ago in an architectural design firm, they had me go and scope out new developments throughout the city. I lived and breathed New York City in college and would go around just staring at the buildings and looking at the amazing architecture and minds that brought these buildings together. And through that insight, I was just so fascinated and became so aware of all the different moving parts. And it's a lot. There's a lot of different things. I think you were just talking to me about it during the pre-show about how there's so many different things happening in a week.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, I remember when I just got started in the real estate field, what I loved so much about it in particular was obviously New York's a very complex market, and finding that information of who is the developer of this building, how can we create an introduction? I love that until this day when I see information, and that's kind of where I've tried to get an advantage in this field, because obviously it's a very competitive field. Every aspect of New York City real estate development place is competitive. So when you have access to information and you find things and you connect with people is my most favorite part. And I kind of pride myself on being able to find that information. To your question, yeah, there's so many moving parts. So like my focus is really from the very early on development side. So we'll come in early with developers and make sure that they're planning a building. We work with architects a lot. That's really going to respond well to a market, especially nowadays. Like you see, unfortunately, so many examples, even in New York City, where the vacancy rate is so low, where buildings were just not properly built to respond appropriately to the market. Like for instance, a few examples come to my mind in the outer boroughs and these new development buildings, areas that are very much family heavy. They're building studio apartments that just take a really really long time to rent. So we really work very early on with developers in this process to ensure that when they're building, their project is going to respond well to the market. And then we move with them across the whole process eventually to actually, we have a whole marketing department and a whole team of agents that do the leasing to actually lease up and market that building. So we see the process all the way through. And on the average week, I'm dealing with buildings that are getting their first initial blockings that are going to be coming to market in 4+ years. And we're dealing with buildings that are going to be leasing in the next 2 months. So you see a very nice spectrum of the whole new development and rental process.
So you're essentially their strategic partner from the get-go to make sure that they have the biggest ROI from day one.
Exactly. And I've seen so many examples, and why I think it's so important to work with experts in your field early on is because there are buildings that I saw start leasing middle of COVID that are doing fine just now, but there are certain layouts that have still not seen initial renters because of whether there are certain columns or windows are placed a certain way or the way the apartment flows wasn't properly advised. So it's very important, and we see it definitely on the rent rolls, that when you bring in experts early on in the process, it absolutely has an effect on your ROI. There's small little things you can do, whether it's from, appliance sizes to closet sizes to ensuite bathrooms to windows to bedroom placements. There's so many different things you can do to ensure that when that renter is eventually going to walk into that apartment, they're going to be interested in paying that top rent that you want to achieve. So it is so important.
Can you give us some examples of like a poor layout that wouldn't rent? Obviously understanding, and this is something that we do before doing any design. In our world, interior design is not aesthetic. It needs to be strategic. Before any design happens, we do market research to understand, like you said, is it family oriented? Is it more studios? What is it that we can do, and how do we set up the layouts, the designs, all of that for the market? But are you seeing anything in particular that doesn't work across the board that maybe most architects or designers are doing?
I can run off a whole bunch of things that come to mind. I mean, the first thing is I'll answer your question backwards is in terms of what the amenities in an apartment need to be. If you're building in an established market in New York City, if you're not putting washer dryers in a unit, you're not renting your apartment. If you're not checking the box on essential amenities like a rooftop deck, which every new building will have, a gym, a co-working space. Those are simple things you're going to do that are going to detract renters if you're not putting those in the building. On more of the layout side, absolutely. We see the Manhattan market is very much a room share market. So you see a lot of 2 roommate apartments where there are 2 rooms, they each have a room, they share the apartment. And so what I like to call wing twos, where bedrooms are not stacked. And it's very important to me that when you're designing layouts of 2 bedrooms, you have bedrooms on the opposite sides of the apartment. You don't want them next to each other. It creates more of a private feel. You have the ability to keep your distance in a sense. If you have a roommate, you have that privacy. Also, what you see a lot is on the studio apartments. Studios are very popular amongst developers because they generally are the most efficient layouts and they produce the highest price per square foot. For studios, there's small things you can do if you're able to create a separate kitchen, even if it includes cutting out parts of the kitchen that might be a little more attractive to a renter. There's always creative ways you can create more of I have an extra room in this apartment. This is not just a studio, but I have a little bit of a separate wing. So we're always looking at many different ways in which the first thing in our mind is like, if I'm renting this apartment in 4 or 5 years from now, or 3 years, depending on how fast the development is ready to go, what are things we can do to ensure that ROI is going to come down the line when it does get rented?
Is your data purely from just seeing what's worked and what doesn't work, or do you have another methodology of kind of tapping into what's currently needed to figure out how do we optimize this for ROI?
Yeah, it's probably a combination. So we're very, very strong with market research. We'll make sure that when we're responding to a specific project that we really have studied that submarket and have seen what has responded well, what has not. And at the same time too, trends are always evolving. I remember in middle of COVID, there were very essential amenities that you needed. And that has kind of changed a little bit. Obviously, washer dryers and co-working spaces were a very big part of it. But now you'd be shocked. I was working on a building last year on the Upper East Side, which did not have a golf simulator. And we lost many prospective tenants of that building because it was lacking the golf simulator. So it's always, of course, we want to make sure we're very much in line with the market, but at the same time, it's always evolving and you have to make sure that you're responding appropriately to the market. So it's kind of a combination of both.
Are there any major things that you think developers don't do that end up costing them majorly, aside obviously for hiring strategic partners at the get-go?
To me, what has always surprised me is, New York City real estate, land in particular, is some of the most expensive in the world. And I'm always surprised sometimes by people we come across will reach out for consultation of how little they've truly planned in their project. They're very much hands off. They've hired a contractor, they have an architect, they're starting construction, but they really don't have their hands on the project. And to me, that's the most basic thing. Having someone, for instance, we're working on this project in Midtown right now, and we've taken a very strong look into the floor plans. And there's one particular layout which we were going back and forth and finding way to fit a second bathroom. And so doing something like that, when you really pay attention to the details, does go a very long way. So I'm always surprised by how many multifamily developers are building without actually paying attention to the details of their project.
Yeah, I agree 100%, because also I am of the opinion that bringing in contractor, architect, interior designer from the get-go, strategist, all from the beginning, working together as a team and coming up with the best game plan, and then, coming back to the table together and keeping lines of communication open. I think that most people, they oversee how important that aspect is, rather than just, hitting the ground running and just running into construction or architecture or design, or bringing the interior designer at the end rather than at the beginning, because they are the ones that position the property for the tenants to attract the tenants. That is the first picture, the renders, or the actual, staged unit is the first thing that potential renters will see. And so having that planning, spending additional time planning, saves so much more. And also I think that there's a bigger uplift, isn't there, when you have all the team in place?
I've always said that the most successful projects that I've seen are the ones in which you have the most people on the call early in the process. When you're bringing in all these consultants early on, you're basically telling everyone that you care about every detail and you want to really ensure that projects do well. I'll go back to something you mentioned earlier about evolving trends. I think specifically in New York City, what we saw post financial crisis in 2009, 2010 was that the market came back so hot that you had people building 2-bedroom apartments and flexing them into 4 or even 5 bedrooms, and they were getting incredible rents and they were doing really well. And I think a trend that I have seen on the negative side is that there are developers who are still kind of stuck in that mindset, and they think it's 2011, 2012 in Bushwick, Brooklyn, where I'm able to build these really small bedrooms and get people to pay these high rents. I think the renter has become a lot more sophisticated on the access to information they have. And so the renter is they're gonna care more about what the interior design looks like. What are my kitchen counter? What are the materials? What's my flooring like? How many fixtures are in my bathroom? These amenities feel a little bit older. I'm a little bit older now. This isn't 2010 anymore. So it's very important. And as you keep saying on the interior design, the first thing that hits you when you walk into an apartment is always the design. Really, when you walk into a lobby, lobbies to me are so incredibly important. It's the first interaction someone's going to have with the building. So if you're not ensuring that you're responding in a fluid way where you're constantly trying to really understand what's going on in the market, then I think that leads to an unsuccessful project at times. So you really got to stay up on the trend. You got to remember that this is not 2010 anymore, and we have very sophisticated renters out there.
Yeah, not to mention that across the country, we're in a buyer's market, and they have either more sway or they're just more, like you said, more discerning.
Absolutely. It's been like that in every capacity that I see, especially in a place like Manhattan where you have really high rent prices. Salaries allow for rent prices to be that high, but at the same time, if I'm going to be spending, $8,500 on a 2-bedroom, I want to ensure this is a place that I want to call home. I think social media, and there's so many different platforms now that try to create transparency with the whole leasing process. So there's no question that on the buying side, on the renting side, people have become so much more sophisticated, and you're not just renting and selling apartments without really putting in that thought process.
Yeah. Do you think that at the beginning of the project, like you said, that you can kind of tell the success by how many people are going to be on that initial call, which is genius. I love that. It's a KPI, really. Do you feel that oftentimes those people that are on that call are strategic in nature, or it's more so them being on the call is the strategic play? Like, where do you see their mindset having a strategic architect, having a strategic designer, contractor being important in this whole formula?
It's both. It's the fact that they're there, but also there have been times where I've been on projects with consultants that I didn't even know existed, whether it's, a trash chute consultant or HVAC or plumbing. Obviously, a lot of them are leading experts in their field, the fact that they're brought on so early into these projects, and they come up with these different points of, how do I say, their expertise really shines, in which they're able to say, if we explore moving X to over here or vice versa, we're changing this system to include, for instance, one of the most popular things that we saw, and this is one of the challenges, is that there were these PTAC units that they used for heat and air conditioning that would take up such a large chunk of the bedroom. And so in a very efficient 10-foot bedroom, you had this large unit in the bedroom, and it made it very difficult to really fit a bed in there and then, walk around it, etc. So when we have some of these experts on early in the process, definitely shows the care and the coordination between the teams to create a successful project, but they come up with so many different things that allow for the project to be successful. So it's definitely both parts.
And also having like a collaborative team, people that are of that mindset, rather than just ego driven and saying, no, it has to be in terms of aesthetics or, functionality, it has to be my way or the highway. The greater good is the ROI of that building. It is the changes and the implementation of strategy that is put into place so that the building can be the most successful possible.
100%. And to your point, I've seen the reverse work not as well, where, an ego can get in the way, where a part of the team wants it done a certain way, whether it's a developer who wants a certain messaging to be created with this building, which is not going to necessarily respond appropriately to the market. So absolutely. But also to your point, when you're able to very early on in the process and you have 10 different consultants on a call, it also speeds up the whole process with communication. So you have, if one consultant's going to say, we should explore putting the plumbing in this capacity, and then you have one of the engineers who says, well, that's not what we're able to do according to code, you create this like much faster communication style. So instead of taking another week to go back and forth over email, you have the ability to communicate early on, and it just allows for a much more seamless process where people trust you more. You're in front of them, you're speaking to them instead of just going back and forth on email. So there are just so many benefits to when you really focus in and create that collaboration early on. And then ultimately, it's just going to lead to a higher return on your investment, which is your time and the money you're putting into this project.
Time is money. The bigger the feedback loops, the faster the feedback loops, the better it is. How do you mitigate any kind of drama or, making sure that it stays smooth between all the different communications and consultants?
I think it's important to really stick to your expertise and kind of like stay in your lane to the best capacity. You're being brought in, you really understand this segment of the project or of the market. It's important to know what you know and what you don't know. There could be someone that has a lot more experience in that. And it's important to sometimes, maybe take a step back if someone who has that greater experience says that we should do it this way. But it goes back to your ego. Egos are not going to create a good building. And sometimes you have to put your ego aside and allow that expert or that team member to go ahead and insert themselves, which could end up being beneficial based on their experience. So putting your ego aside definitely allows that to move forward.
Yeah, that's huge. What are you seeing right now in terms of trends in New York City? I know that there is some major waves happening now. Talk to us about what's going on and what do you potentially see happening?
Yeah, so I think it's very important for people to know. With the Mamdani campaign in particular, one of the biggest talking points in the real estate community was the freezing of rents. And what that really means is freezing just rent stabilized apartments. Essentially, what happens is there is a board that comes together together that's appointed by the mayor, which is called the Rent Guidelines Board, the RGB, and they have the ability to vote each year on what the increases should be for stabilized apartments. So it's happened in the past where on the landlord side, these increases are minimal. It makes them very difficult to kind of continue operating these buildings and providing those good apartments because they have to make money themselves. They can't be losing money. But at the same time, it's happened where, like in COVID, the Rent Guidelines Board, there was a recent example of them freezing the rents where the increases were 0%. That's not to say that there can be things that we don't expect, but that is something we have recently seen just in the past 5 or 6 years where the rents were frozen on these stabilized units. But it's important also to remember that the mayor, as far as the real estate community understands, doesn't necessarily have the ability at the moment to freeze rent across the board. And there are about 1 million rent stabilized apartments that he's referencing, which he plans to stabilize and to freeze those rents. And so once again, no one really knows what's going to happen, but it's not to say that we don't have a precedent for this happening recently. In terms of the whole development, I personally think one of the hottest topics is affordability in New York City, specifically in housing. If you look at something like New Rochelle, there was a New York Times article a few weeks ago how they're one of the only cities in the entire country that were able to find a way to lower rents. And the way that was done is because they really allowed the local government, allowed for development to become a lot easier on the building side, whether that's with the different rules and regulations and zoning. So the reality is the only way rental pricing will ever come down and the housing supply shortage is fixed is just to allow more and more development. So, with Mamdani coming into office, the bright side that I really hope for is that with the rezonings in Long Island City that just went through and the Midtown South rezoning, hopefully there's an opportunity in which developers will be incentivized to build. So if he's able to get that done, I think that would hopefully be a success, but there's definitely some concern out there with what the next administration is going to do on the housing side.
You're definitely the optimist because I've heard a lot of people freaking out.
At the same time, in every market cycle, the FAIR Act came out in June, which essentially did not allow for a real estate agent in New York City to charge a broker fee. And what required them to do is to have the landlord pay the broker fee. And so that definitely shifted the market. But with every challenge in a market, there's always an opportunity. In 2019, when the rent stabilization, the new law affected all the apartments that were rent stabilized, obviously a lot of owners lost a lot of equity and the value of their apartments were cut in half overnight. It still created an opportunity. You see a lot of people now, even 6 years later, purchasing those apartments at these steep discounts. So in every market cycle and every market challenge, there's absolutely an opportunity, so you got to look at the bright side and see what we can do. Hopefully with the push of more affordable housing under the Mamdani administration, it really spurs development, which should hopefully create more opportunity for everyone in the real estate space. So that's my sense of optimism here, but it remains to be seen.
What are you seeing or hearing from people in New York City in terms of their confidence and willingness to continue to invest and stay? Because from what I understand, a lot of people are looking to leave, taking their businesses, taking their investments. What's happening there?
I think what's important, and someone reminded me of this yesterday, is that the mayor will sit in office for 4 years, and 4 years is a short time in the greater grand scheme of a whole market. I think it's mixed. I'm seeing both. I'm seeing panic where people are saying, okay, I'm waking up tomorrow and I'm selling my apartment or I'm selling my house and I'm moving to Florida. On the other end of the spectrum, I've heard from a lot of people that are currently working on projects that are under development. They're not going to stop developing. They're going through, especially with the different tax abatement programs that currently exist for developers in New York City. There are deadlines that have to be met. So they're not stopping. They can continue to go. So I've definitely seen a mix of emotions in terms of response to the recent election.
It's so fascinating to watch it. I'm in New York, but I'm not in the city anymore. So it's quite interesting to see through so many different cycles in the economy how things have changed. But I think the ultimate thing is that panic is never, and fear is never a good driver for change.
Absolutely not. I totally agree. Especially in the context of housing, creating fear and panic hurts everyone across the whole industry. If I'm an owner, my first gut is going to say, how do I raise my rent? If I'm a tenant, my first gut is going to tell me, how do I get out of my lease? So creating panic and fear definitely does not assist in a moving market. I totally agree with that.
In terms of data, metrics, KPIs, what are your core numbers to know whether a development is really hitting the mark, it's really maximizing its potential?
I think it's two. Number one is obviously price per square foot. You want to make sure that when you're leasing, you're achieving a price per square foot that's comparable, if not higher than the submarket the building's in. The other thing is turnover. There's always a back and forth with one of the most common things we consult on are unit mixes. So how many studios, 1 bedrooms, 2s and 3s, and sometimes 4 bedrooms should we build in a specific market? And so the tug and pull is always on these larger units, you see a lower price per square foot because they're not as efficient versus these smaller units like the studios and 1 bedrooms, you tend to see higher price per square foot. But at the same time, studios and 1 bedrooms tend to have higher turnover than someone in a 2 or 3. It's likely that in a 2 or 3 bedroom, you'll have, whether it's a couple or a couple with a child, and they're going to likely stay for a longer period of time versus someone in the studio. They tend to be looking for more space. Maybe I'll upgrade to a 1 bedroom, etc. So they're likely to not renew. So it's always the tug and pull of should we build these larger units that'll have longer, more of a retention versus these smaller units, which will have a smaller retention rate. But at the same time, price per square foot is very important. If you're not meeting price per square foot in a submarket, something is wrong. Whether the layouts weren't done correctly, whether the marketing wasn't done correctly, something is missing. So those are the two major benchmarks we use.
Yeah, it's usually a combination because I oftentimes see like there are beautiful spaces. There was capital expenditure on, upgrades or whatever it is, but then the marketing is off, right? Or they didn't use the opportunity to do like a virtual walkthrough, social media, making sure demand is everything, right? So building up demand, especially in the time of ads and like digital ads and social media, I think that there's a huge opportunity that a lot of people are missing.
Yeah, 100%. It's also important, and this is more on the marketing side, that we're always evolving, and social media is something we take very seriously because as we move forward in technology, there's so many different platforms in which you can advertise, whether it's your business or whether it's your apartments, whether it's really any opportunity. And so we see that the firms out there that aren't necessarily as successful as maybe they used to be is because they're not kind of emerging with the new technologies, the social media that's out there, and they're a little bit behind. And to your point on marketing, we've seen so many times where an owner will go ahead and they'll upgrade apartments. So whether they're including new dishwashers or they added in a new amenity space, and that is never properly marketed. So you go on Street Easy in New York City and the dishwasher box is not checked. Something so simple as that, you're not properly advertising to your tenant base, to your client base of what this apartment is. So it's very important that, especially as the market is so competitive, you have to make sure you're always kind of a step ahead with the new technologies, with being as transparent and being as detailed as possible when it comes to marketing.
I think that at the end of the day, my belief is that interior design, which people have a hard time with just the word interior design because they see it as like a luxury, but I believe that it's a marketing and sales tool at the end of the day that draws people in.
100%. The previous firm I was at, we were very much focused on the condominium sales, Manhattan new development condominium sales. And I think that more than ever, the interior design is probably the most important part when it comes to marketing a home, because as you're dealing with real estate that have these much higher values, you're dealing with clients that have these much larger budgets, they care about every single detail. The biggest difference I see in the condo versus rental, the condo side, when you're purchasing a home, it's so important that everything is meticulously crafted for the interior design and for the appliance package and for the finishes, because that's really what's going to sell an apartment. There's one building in particular, and I won't say what it is, that has wonderful views, and you walk into this apartment and for whatever reason, by the balconies, which most of these units have outdoor space, there's this fixture, and it's intended to be some sort of design fixture, which is blocking your view of the outdoor space, your actual view when you walk into the apartment. That's not even on the positive side of interior design to show you what it could do and how it can create such a great apartment to obviously sell it, but also on the reverse side, that's something that's this, I think, is one of the reasons why this building had so much trouble. So, of course, I think as you get into these higher price points, it becomes more and more of a priority to ensure that the interior design is like the most incredible package you could provide to the prospective buyer.
What are you seeing as opportunities right now in the market? Like the biggest opportunities maybe that people are not necessarily taking advantage of?
That's a great question. I think if someone asked me last week about where would you continue to develop, I think there's so much opportunity in New York in particular, in the outer boroughs. There's such a focus on Manhattan, and land is at such a premium that it makes it very difficult to kind of develop real estate and turn a profit on it. I think the outer boroughs of New York City, Queens in particular, Eastern Queens, there are so many opportunities that it boggles my mind why they are not being taken advantage of. They check every box in terms of community infrastructure, transportation, schools. You have everything you can possibly need, and there's just a lack of development there. So that, I think, is the biggest opportunity right now, is some of the outer borough emerging submarkets that can be developed.
What are the key things that a developer should look for when they're looking at a piece of land? Like you had just said, infrastructure and all those. Are there key things that would make one a better investment than another?
Transportation is by far the most important one, because you see a lot of tenant base in New York City doesn't necessarily drive. You see buildings that will perform significantly better if they're 2 or 3 blocks from the subway compared to a building that is 2 or 3 blocks further from the subway. We were just looking at something in Queens, and they're having trouble with their re-rentals, and it really came down to transportation. So it's very important that you're in an area that will be attractive to renters in terms of transportation. You can't just build anywhere, even though it's New York City. You can't build somewhere where you're 20 minutes from a subway, or you have to take 2 buses to get to the train. It's very important that you look at transportation. That by far to me is the most important one.
What insights. So incredible. Your wealth of information. I just have one last question for you. If there was something that you wish I would have asked and I didn't, what would that be?
First off, I will say your questions are fantastic and very well pointed. I don't think I have a good answer, because I think what motivates me so much about this industry and the work I do is that it's so important to be ahead of everything. And that is very much, and I think planning is the biggest part of that. You always have to plan, because that's ultimately what's going to affect it. I look at some of the pro formas on real estate, and the margins are not nearly as high as we see in the TV shows, and we see in, we imagine, where developers are spending hundreds of millions of dollars and they're only returning X%, which is not as much as we thought. So I think it's so important to, like, a business like yours, where you're able to really provide like monetary value to the client, where, whether you're designing a house or whether you're designing an apartment building, there's so many things you can do to still create an unbelievable product, but also not spend unnecessarily. And so I think that's what drives my passion about this industry is, I love walking into an apartment and saying, wow, this really works. This is going to be very easy to have tenants in here that never want to leave, versus, unfortunately, times where you walk into an apartment or a home and you say, okay, this was done quite oddly and it's going to affect the rent. It's going to hurt everyone. So I love how you're passionate about that. And I think it's so important to the real estate market.
Amazing. Leave our audience with your top 3 tips for developing, whether it's in New York City or around the country.
Number 1, don't be afraid to engage with people that you might not have engaged with in the past. So if you're creating a project, and just because your most recent project was successful, make sure you're engaging. We see a lot of foreign real estate companies that are coming to New York for the first time that kind of hire us early on in the process to ensure they're building. So engage with people in any capacity that you don't necessarily think you will need. That's tip number 1. I think tip number 2 is just communication. There's a lot of moving parts early on in the real estate process, especially in development. Communicating goes a very long way. A lot of big decisions happen on the fly. You're sitting on a call, you're sitting in a meeting, and someone makes a quick decision. It's very important to always communicate so that everyone's on the same page and ensuring that the proper decisions are being made. And number 3, not necessarily part of the development process, but just consistency. I'm a big believer. My main motto is, if you want to be successful at anything, you need to be consistent. So in tying that to development, if you're developing land, like, you got to be consistent with really understanding the market, speaking to people, delving into what you think you're going to be building. It's just really creating a sense of consistency. So whether that's talking to locals, talking to brokers, talking to previous landowners, people that currently currently own, it's very important to be consistent and ensure that when you're doing anything over time, you continue with that consistency so that it'll lead to success.
Thank you so much, Joseph. And if our audience wants to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
I can share my email address is joseph.s@realnyproperties.com. I'm available on LinkedIn, Joseph Segal. Search me up. realny.com is our company website, so feel free to reach out. And I love talking to people, so reach out anytime.
Amazing. And our last names are spelled almost the same, except mine has an I. Amazing.
You have an extra letter, but it's a great last name.
Amazing. Yes, I agree. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Leah.